to ask you what you think the role of methodology is in history. When I look at the social sciences, there's a great deal of attention to methodological advances, and I don't see that in history so much, and I don't see methodology being an important part of graduate education in history, and I wonder if, and by methodology I mean statistical methodology. To some extent there is, there was early a movement towards quantitative history. Chuck Tilley did a great deal of work to try to show that newspapers could be used to analyze collective action events. And since then, there are lots of opportunities for quantitative history that exist. It seems to me that the profession has turned away from that, and I'm wondering if you think that's a good thing or if I'm right about that, and what you think about it.
I think you're absolutely right, and I think that those people who still do it have become historical sociologists. I see, they show up at Social Science History Association, and there are a few of them. I think that got pushed out by cultural history in a way. I think there was much more of that before the rise of cultural history, and it would be interesting to bring it back. But I think it's being done in sociology. Would be my answer.
I suppose I would agree in part, but we do have a sort of sister field. It's a great sibling rivalry between international historians and political scientists in their subfield of international relations theory. And so a lot of the statistical and quantitative analysis, those types of methodologies are being done in that subfield. And many of those departments are becoming dominated, as you know, by game theorists. And that's something that I think a lot of historians are very wary of. And it doesn't mesh with a lot of historians' views of how people really think. And so I think there's a great deal of concern about getting too much into statistical and quantitative analysis. So I'd say there it can be a role for it. I remember one very good work done by Tom Childers, a Nazi historian of the Nazi voter, a good book in which he did large-scale statistical voting analysis and came up with some interesting findings. But on the whole, I think we tend to be wary of it, yeah.
I have a question in the sociology of knowledge, and that is, how do we explain how history changes as a discipline? And to sort of oversimplify it, fields can change because of new paradigmatic works that are so influential that they set an agenda, set criteria for what counts, set a model that people can follow. So if you look at the rise of social history, E.P. Thompson was just a game-changing work. Then there's the discourse around fields and a lot of what you were doing because of the time limits that you have sort of take the form of discourse about the field. So after E.P. Thompson, there was a whole lot of work that talked about E.P. Thompson and talked about social history. Y'all didn't really give any paradigmatic works for sort of history as it's going forward. And so the question is, are there paradigmatic works that are changing the face of history? And is the role of paradigmatic works changing in history relative to sort of discourse about history?
Well, yeah, I think that's a great question. I had a couple of books in my talk that I zipped out because of the time constraints. One of the books that I think really sort of moved political history towards transnational history is a book by Isabel Hull, who's at Cornell, that some of you may even know her, called Absolute Destruction. And she was the first to go and study German military culture in Namibia, what is now Namibia, at the turn of the century. There was a genocide. The German military murdered the Herero tribe in Africa. And she looked at the culture, the orders, how there was this genocide, then sort of covered up, and then looked at the connections between that and the Holocaust. And she found connections of personnel, but she also found connections in ideology, right? So she was one of the first to say, German culture, German military culture, learned something in Africa and brought it home in the 30s and 40s. And now the whole transnationalist category has been opened up even more. A book that came out this year that I think is going to be a paradigmatic book by David Carlo called Advertising Empire looks at the ways in which racialized and racist advertising from sort of 1890 through the Weimar Republic, through the early 30s, images of caricatures of Africans to sell tobacco, to sell chocolate. The way these circulated across Europe, many of them actually came out of the United States and then circulate across the European continent, and in some cases, to the rest of the world. So I think these are examples of that's an example of a kind of cultural transnational history, and I think people read those and then apply that to their own work. But Bill, I also wanted to say that in addition, if you take the E.P. Thompson example, I agree with you that he in some ways gave birth to social history, but I think the events around that period gave birth to it as well. So it's the paradigmatic book, it's the new methodology, and then what's going on in the world.
Okay. I think you've answered it. Okay. Well said.
I'd like to get you to focus on where your two domains of work intersect. And it seems to me in Europe today, not only do you have the rise of Muslim minorities who are both integrating and feeling oppressed, at the same time you have a rise of very deep unease in the native lower middle class about the breakdown of the welfare state and the changing nature of the labor market and the lack of future for their kids. And my question is, what does your current work tell us about how this is likely to unfold over the next 10 years in Europe?
Maybe I should take that. Okay.
I think that there has been consistent right-wing parties getting certain percentage of the vote in Europe really since World War II, and they come and they go and they rise and fall in each country. And I think maybe in this respect, I'm an optimist. I think the Europeans are going to stand up for their welfare state. I think they like it, and I think that huge crowds turn out when there are threats to it. It remains to be seen, given the crisis with the euro, whether they'll be able to really hold on to it. But I think that's the issue occupying most Europeans' minds.
I have a question that goes back to sort of the beginning of your talk about the sort of looking ahead part, Zachary, with regards to the idea that a better informed populace about war is actually, and I don't want to misquote you here, but is sort of going to be able to make better decisions about war. Now, I certainly, as an academic, would love to believe that knowledge improves behavior, improves choices. But as a psychologist, I also know that my life would be a heck of a lot easier if that were actually true. And very often we have evidence that it's not true. So I'm wondering if there is any evidence to suggest what I optimistically would like to believe, which is that having people better informed about unnecessary wars in the past, about mistakes that people have made in regard to war, would allow us to make better decisions in the future.
Great question. Thank you so much. The argument is not that you will definitely get more circumspection, but that you have a better chance of getting it if you have greater knowledge and you've thought about these issues more deeply and you've been educated. Now, of course, people are very often more swayed by emotion, and leaders use that to great effect. But if we want to counter that, I would say the answer is not to then throw up our hands and say, obviously we don't do that, right? What we're trying to do is educate students and give people some tools to reason with. Now, again, no guarantees you'll get better, but I would certainly rather have an educated populace educated about these issues. Studying wars no more has not caused wars to go away, right? And it's in fact left people hungry for knowledge, as Marla referenced. With the Hitler Channel, people are very interested in the general population about war. If we could spend more time talking about the causes of war, its conduct and its consequences, let people see more the horrors of war in classroom techniques in film and so on, with literature, with real-life accounts. There's a new book out right now called What It's Like to Go to War. by a Vietnam vet. These kinds of things, I think, could certainly make inroads. But to your point, no, there absolutely are no guarantees, but I believe it's better to have it than not. Marla, do you have thoughts on it or no?
Well, I think that Carolyn is sort of raising the question of the relevance of the past for the present, right? What do we get out of it? I think it's, on our minds right now. I'm thinking about, this Occupy movement all over the United States. Is this emerging social movement? Are there other historical social movements that they're thinking about referring back to? How would they access that, right? We're a society that broke the memory of a radical past, right, during the Cold War under McCarthyism. If they wanted to look back to the 30s, how would they do that? And maybe there's something historians can do to help these, people who look like kids to me, searching to make a social movement. So.
I'd like to follow up on that question by returning to the issue of academic history and popular history. Because like you, I'm convinced that knowledge makes a difference, but just as presumably therapy leads to insight that leads to people changing their behavior. But how do you think about the connections going forward between the kind of history, the very sophisticated history that you do and that gets done, and the dissemination of the kind of knowledge that people need, both substantive and just the appreciation of the importance of understanding, stepping back and understanding these forces? How do you see that connection being made so that popular history doesn't just become a recycling, really, of the worst sort of history and of stereotyping, as opposed to the kind of history that really can help people have the logical tools to think through political decisions in the future as individuals and groups and political parties?
Well, I think history departments need to be more open to popular history. Now, if you publish a book with a trade press, if you publish something that might have a readership outside your subfield, it actually counts less than a book with a university press. So I do think from the top down there needs to be an openness to, what's been almost disdainfully called popular history.
Obviously, I couldn't agree more. One of the worst things that may have happened to my career is that I had a review in the Oprah magazine to my my book on blunders in international history. There's I think a good historian at Harvard named Neil Ferguson. He's considered a popular historian in many ways. He does academic history. He does popular history as well. He writes for Newsweek, a column. Probably another mark against him in the minds of many historians. I don't see it that way. I think it's great to bring historical insights to a wider public. That's what we need to be doing. And he wrote a column recently that said, why is it, or maybe it's not surprising, that in Harry Potter, the history teacher, I think he's a ghost, is that right? I think the history teacher in Harry Potter he was so boring. It was the most boring class that anyone ever took, that I think he died of boredom, the teacher, and now he's this ghost and he haunts the classroom. Perhaps not surprising that they chose the history teacher to fill that role in the books, because history is so often presented that way, and if we want to change people's minds and attitudes and bring history to the populace, it should be done in a very different way. History should be presented, or at least one way it should be presented, is as problem solving. Why did these big events occur and unfold as they did? And what's the detective work we need to do to answer those questions and really draw people in that way, rather than in the old way that is still done, reciting a narrative. Now, there's a role for narrative, of course, yes, but there's more that we can do in changing the way we present history. So, yeah.
A great example of a popular history book that I'd like to draw people's attention to is Adam Hochschild last year wrote To End All Wars, right? So it is, it is about war, but what it's really about is the peacemakers. He went back and he looked at who, between 1914 and 1918, particularly in Britain, but also a little bit in Germany, who came out against World War I, right? And he wanted, it was a cry against war, what it was actually saying. There were these Bertrand Russell, Charlotte Despard. There were some very articulate, important people in England who went to jail because they understood that World War I was going to be a cataclysm and that it was, a war for nothing. And it's very accessible. It's very well written. I highly recommend it.
Didn't he also write prize-winning King Leopold's Ghost, right? Also a wonderful book about the Congo. Okay.
So I have a question to take us back to that issue of methodology. I was sort of tickled when Michael mentioned methodology and immediately said it's statistics, of course, And I want to point out, as historian, that we also have other kinds of methodology and sub-methodologies, I guess, in the fields. But our basic methodology is that we teach our students to be critical readers, to assess the historiography, figure out what people have already said and how they agree and whether it's good, and then we teach them to be critical readers of primary sources and things like that. But my question takes us beyond methodology to the question of historical truth. I remember in my department at about the time when the Historical Society that Zach mentioned declared itself to be splitting off from history because they were just fed up with cultural history, we did lose one historian in my department. He decamped to poli-sci because he said you can't prove anything with your cultural history. There's no truth there. You can't replicate the experiment. It's not real. It's all subjective. The vast majority of us didn't agree. We stayed obviously in the department using our critical abilities and methodologies to write history that we thought was as accurate as you could get for the historical periods with the sources we had. We're confident that we're producing, I hate to say it, truth. And so I wanted you to talk a little bit about this concept of what historians produce and how reliable it is, and how strongly would you make the claim that you're getting it right? Okay.
Well, first of all, don't hate to say it. Truth is good.
Yeah,
Okay.
right, exactly.
We're in the truth business. And I think the way that we counter arguments like that is you say, well, there are logical arguments, and that you can logically test and empirically test arguments. And so it's not true that we don't prove things. Yes, there are always going to be areas where you're open to interpretation, and that's good. But there are other areas that are nearly impossible or impossible to contest based on sound logic and reasoning. And so you don't necessarily need quantitative analysis to get to that, right? I'm sure I can say more on this, but maybe Marla, you want to weigh in?
No, I agree. But Nancy's, I think, maybe you were speaking to as well, there are cases of cultural history, which I mentioned in my talk, where there isn't enough evidence, right? Where the evidentiary base doesn't support the claim. And I think that's sort of given cultural history a bad name. I think the majority of it is done very carefully, with going into the archives, with a serious study of a range of materials. But then you do get cases where there are a few cultural products and they're used to prove an entire historical point about a period, and that I think doesn't work. And then there is the pendulum that swings. I've seen it in my own subfield that people who study Italian fascism got very taken with the culture, and looked at all this art and architecture that was produced and patronized by Mussolini, and started to forget about the violence that brought the regime to power, the violence that kept political prisoners in prison, and all of this. And so now the pendulum has swung back, and we've got a bunch of books about the level of violence in fascist Italy and putting it back in the story, comparing it again to Hitler and Stalin. So there's truth, but there are also pendulum swings, I think, in any field.
And there are very weak arguments. I remember once, I think it was in an oral exam, I was asked, what do you make of the argument that youth in Germany who jazz was banned by the Nazis, largely because it was mostly performed by Jewish Americans and African Americans. And the argument was that youth who went covertly to jazz concerts were therefore expressing their political opposition to the Nazi movement. Well, I mean, what do you make of an argument like that? I think they go because they enjoy jazz and they And the fact that it was banned verboten it made it even more alluring. Unless you can show that they were handing out anti-Nazi pamphlets and signing up and then engaged in some kind of political action, I don't think you can make that kind of link. So yeah, there are always these weak arguments. And that doesn't mean that things cannot be proved. It means that we have to be very wary of the kinds of cultural and social history, and in any subfield, international history as well. There are always weak arguments to be made. But our methodology is built in large part around amassing corroborating evidence, right? And then testing that evidence as well. So, go ahead.
I think I'm going to disagree with you, Zach. The issue of kinds of resistance in Nazism and fascism was a big issue, and the swing kids debate. Well, I actually think that in a totalitarian regime, the kids who decided to go to a jazz club, they knew exactly what Jewish black music represented, and I think it was a kind of resistance. No, it's not the same resistance as going underground, getting a gun and blowing up a train, but there are levels of resistance, right? And I think this was the first level of resistance.
All right, it depends exactly what you're going to claim, right? If it's a weak level of resistance, I'd need more proof. So here's the kind. Now you're witnessing right, firsthand the kinds of debates we have in our field. Okay.
Question for Zach. I'm curious about how you conceptualize the kind of international conflict you were talking about that involves the rise of militant Muslim groups, terrorism, and so on. This is very different from a traditional international war. It's a distributed, decentralized kind of conflict. And of course, it became very important using the metaphor of war to talk about it, and our response about it was very important ideologically to the Bush administration, but I would say very problematic politically and also conceptually. Lumping this kind of thing together with war, as we traditionally think about it, does seem problematic. And I wonder if you have some theory about what to call this kind of international conflict.
Right. I'm very happy you asked that. Okay. So first, you're right. This is not a traditional international history undertaking. It's because it's not state to state, right? There are no Muslim-led Panzer divisions sweeping across the Rhineland or cutting through the Ardennes. What we have is a whole range of issues that involve international conflict. And what I wanted to do was, in part, counter the prevailing Chicken Little-esque literature that was out there, Eurabia, Londonistan, Why Europe Slept, and all of these works that were coming out saying Muslims are taking over the continent and they hate America, they hate Europe, they're going to create this caliphate across Europe and so on. Of course, it's wildly overblown, and I wanted to get at what really is happening there, which is much more nuanced and represents ambivalence. And then you had to separate out the few extremists from a great mass of people who do feel integrated, and another great mass who feel that they have not been accepted, don't fit in, and have a really curious pattern forming that they're becoming less well integrated than their parents or grandparents may have been, and adopting a Muslim first identity, that identity is shifting. Okay, now, how is this an international conflict? It is an international tension. It is not a war, obviously. And I'm very much against using that, and I write about this in the conclusion, in fact. Writing about and using metaphors of war is extremely harmful and damaging because it casts Muslim Europeans as an enemy, and there's some sort of battle going on with the territory to be occupied. It's extremely unhelpful and inaccurate. And so we have to abandon those kinds of things, the war metaphors, but we do need to think about it as an international tension source and a source of conflict. I can't give you an overall theory at this point for how we need to conceptualize it, but what I would say is that we need to broaden our understanding of what are international conflicts, what are their roots, and even how should we think about them and talk about them, what language we should use. Okay.
Thanks for a great presentation. I think about when we're talking about even just sort of basic facts like where was Obama born, or is he Muslim, and the ways in which historical facts where there's a lot of evidence to the contrary seem to be readily believed by large proportion of the population in the United States. And so I'm wondering sort of if you could talk a little bit about the challenge in terms of really having this sort of critical thinking or utilization of evidence that might be available to people here, or perhaps from a historical perspective in thinking about the kind of disinformation and the way that political issues get framed by various media sources at this point. Is there any reason to have hope? Are there any solutions that you can come up with? Because it feels a little overwhelming to me when we think about connecting historical truth to a larger proportion of the society.
Would you like to?
Sure. Well, Emily, you really raised the issue of propaganda, right? With the birth of the modern nation state and with the birth of modern technology, you can repeat a lie, and if it's repeated enough times, a certain percentage of the population believes it. Joseph Goebbels, very proudly said, the big lie, the more you say it, the bigger it is, the more you can convince people with. And then that sort of gets into psychological questions, that there's certain lies that in certain historical times people are open to believing, right, that fit their preconditions, their prejudices, right? The lie in Nazi Germany that the Jews were our misfortune. That was the line they used over and over again. So, Obama's not American, Obama's a Muslim. It doesn't matter that it's not true almost, right? Because it somehow fills a need.
Yeah.
I don't know if that... Solutions, yeah. I don't know.
Take control of the media and
Right.
right. I don't have all the solutions.
Well,
I do have hope.
One solution would be a more balanced media culture. In Europe, people explicitly know I'm buying the newspaper of this right-wing party or this liberal party or this communist party, and so they know the line they're going to get, and they know what truth to believe, right? The government supports the press and wants a range of options in the press. In Europe, we don't have that, right? We've got a conglomeration so that people don't have choices and they can't turn the channel and really hear another truth.
You mean it's not called the Fair and Balanced Times that you can buy at the local store? Right? Yeah. Okay.
Well, thank you very much.
Sure, thank you.